The most powerful heavy fighter of almost the entire war grew out of an ordinary bomber in a matter of months, out of desperation. Think about that. The machine was put into production with no faith in it. People laughed at it. They gave it the name Beaufighter, as if in mockery of its angular, graceless silhouette. And then the laughter stopped. This machine saw, in pitch darkness, what the human eye could not. Its pilots were called men with cat's eyes, and the public was fed a fine legend to explain it. To speak the real reason aloud was forbidden. It sank whole convoys and lost not a single aircraft. It tore apart sea giants of 50,000 tons, with almost every round on target. It knocked the enemy out of the sky over his own occupied land. And today, of more than 6,000 of these machines, just 2 remain alive. What was it? The brilliant calculation of a single engineer, a cold, secret technology hidden from prying eyes, or the composure of men who died more often on landing than in battle? Before you lies the file on an aircraft that changed the course of the night war and vanished almost without a trace the moment the guns fell silent. Watch to the end, and you will understand why the name Beaufighter had, in the end, to be spoken in no jest at all. Britain entered the Second World War with a machine that drew quiet smirks at first. A heavy twin-engine fighter grown out of an ordinary bomber, angular, bulky, graceless, and yet the most powerful heavy fighter of almost the entire war. How could that even happen? Here is how. The Beaufighter turned out to be so versatile that it shone exactly where no one expected anything from it. A night interceptor, a hunter of the enemy's own radar fighters, a torpedo carrier, a platform for rockets, one airframe, and several trades at once, and it reached the front rank in every one of them. This goes to the very heart of the whole story. What stands before us is not merely metal with engines and cannon. It is an aircraft that began as a forced improvisation and ended as the terror of German bombers and the destroyer of entire convoys. A machine named Beaufighter, almost as a joke at first. And then that name had to be spoken in earnest. Hitler seized power, and Germany surged into the sky so fast that London went cold. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden the Germans a military air force. Forget it. The bans went into the bin, and German factories began stamping out warplanes by the hundred. The Luftwaffe was reborn not by the day, but by the hour, and every new bomber with a black cross on its wing was a direct threat to English cities. The British Air Ministry grasped a simple truth. There was no room to fall behind, not by a single month. In answer to the swift revival of the German Air Force, an entire program to develop new types of combat aircraft was launched. Not one machine, a whole line of them. Fighters, bombers, interceptors. Britain was preparing for a war not yet declared, yet already felt in the skin. This goes to one of the key documents in the whole story. In 1937, a specification was approved under the index AMF 37/35. Behind that dry string of letters and figures lay a perfectly concrete and uncompromising demand. Give us a heavy cannon fighter able to fight night bombers. Not a light, twitchy machine for the daytime dogfight, but a heavy hunter built for a single task, to meet the enemy in the dark and tear him apart with gunfire. Why at night exactly? Because the English already knew what bombs falling from a black sky meant. A daytime interceptor is fine while there is light and the target can be seen. And at night? At night you need a machine with a large fuel reserve, with heavy armament, with a crew able to loiter for a long time and wait. The specification demanded precisely this: endurance, firepower, and the ability to patrol over the protected target for as long as possible. This goes also to the armament written into the requirement. 4 20mm cannon. That was what the nose of the future machine was meant to carry. By the standards of the late 30s, this sounded almost insolent. Most fighters of the time made do with rifle-caliber machine guns, and here was a whole battery of automatic cannon. The logic was simple and merciless. One well-aimed burst should be enough to tear apart any German bomber in the air. Not damage it, not drive it off, tear it apart. And so, before the first shot, before the first drawing of the future Beaufighter, the portrait of a machine was born on paper, a machine destined to change the night war in the skies over Britain. Heavy, cannon-armed, nocturnal, long-ranged. Britain knew what it needed. What remained was to find the one who would build it. The English invented nothing from scratch. They remembered. They remembered all too well. More than 20 years before the new war, a shadow had already hung over London, crawling out of the black sky, and that shadow was called the Zeppelin. Vast German airships came by night, heavy and almost soundless, and dropped their bombs on the sleeping city. The British capital, which had thought itself untouchable behind its strip of sea, learned for the first time what war falling from above onto peaceful streets really meant. This goes to the rawest wound in British defense of that age. Interceptors existed, anti-aircraft guns existed, and the use of them was small. By the time the engines were heard on the ground, by the time the alarm was raised, by the time the pilots reached their machines and started their engines, the airship was already over its target. And then came the most humiliating part. The fighter would tear itself off the ground and run straight into plain, blunt physics. To reach the enemy, you must climb to his altitude. And climbing takes time. Long, agonizing minutes spiraling upward while the bombs are already bursting below, and it was almost always too late. The Zeppelin did its work and slid back into the darkness, while the interceptor reached the right level only when there was no longer anyone to catch. The black sky swallowed the enemy, and the pilot came home with nothing. This repeated time after time, and from that helplessness was born a hard lesson the British burned into their minds. To react to an enemy already in flight is to lose in advance. This goes to the logic that, 20 years on, became the spine of the technical requirement. The conclusion drew itself, cold and beyond dispute. If the interceptor cannot climb to altitude after taking off, then it must not take off on the alarm at all. It must already be in the air, already at height, already on its combat course while the enemy is only approaching the city. Not to chase, but to meet. Not to react, but to lie in wait, ruling the night sky into invisible patrol corridors. And to wait in the air for a long time, you need a particular kind of machine. A light fighter would burn its fuel in a matter of minutes and head for landing at exactly the moment a target appeared. That Britain could no longer afford. What was needed was a twin-engine heavyweight with a large fuel reserve, able to grind the sky over the protected target for hours without leaving its post. Endurance became a weapon as much as the cannon. An aircraft that can wait a long time strikes first, and whoever strikes first in the night sky, as a rule, wins. This goes also to the human factor, which is rarely recalled. To hang for hours in a cold, dark cockpit, staring into black emptiness, is a trial not every man can bear. The enemy is invisible. The ground is invisible. There is no horizon. There is only the drone of your own engines, the flicker of the instruments, and nerves stretched to the limit. A machine for such work must be reliable, stable, and as comfortable as a night hunter can ever be. Otherwise, the crew breaks before it meets its first German. So the memory of the helplessness of the First World War turned into a concrete set of demands for the future Beaufighter. No one in London wanted again to stare into the night sky and listen to bombs bursting in the streets while fighters clawed uselessly upward. The lesson of the Zeppelins had been paid for in blood, and the English had no intention of paying that price a second time. The new machine was obliged to meet the enemy in his own element, in the dark, at height, face to face. The requirement was written, hard, clear, allowing no double readings. Heavy, cannon-armed, nocturnal, enduring. Only a small thing remained: to find those who would turn these words into metal, able to take off and fight. And it was right here that the first serious failure in the whole story began. This goes to the very core of the British aircraft industry of the late 30s. Serious names took up the work. No chance workshops, but firms with reputation and experience. In the middle of 1938, the Bristol Aeroplane Company presented its design for a heavy fighter under the index Type 151. The machine looked solid and seemed to answer every point of the specification. On paper, exactly what was wanted. But Bristol was not alone. Two other well-known firms entered the same program, Hawker and Westland. Each brought its own vision of what a nocturnal cannon hunter ought to be. 3 designs, 3 engineering schools, 3 different approaches to one and the same task. One might think the choice was there, the competition healthy, and all that remained was to take the best and set it running. This goes to the moment when fine words shatter against harsh scrutiny. The Air Ministry Commission did not hurry. The specialists sat down over the drawings and the calculations and began to take each design apart bolt by bolt, rib by rib, kilogram of estimated weight by kilogram. And the deeper they dug, the clearer the unpleasant result became. Not one of the 3 designs satisfied them. Not Bristol, not Hawker, not Westland. After thorough analysis, the Commission sent all 3 machines back for revision at once. Not 1, not 2, all of them. It was a verdict, even if not a final one. The best firms in the country, having gathered their best engineers, could not on the first attempt give the military what the military wanted. Each design fell short somewhere, sagged somewhere, promised too much, and too unconvincingly somewhere. The paper proved stronger than the intention. This goes to the cold arithmetic of time, which no one had abolished. Revision is not a couple of weeks. It is new calculations, new wind tunnel runs, new approvals, new arguments between designers and customer. Months. And every month lost in the late 30s was worth its weight in gold, because across the channel, the German factories did not stop for a single day and went on hammering out warplanes at the same merciless speed. And here was the position Britain found itself in. The specification existed. The threat existed. The money existed. The best firms had been brought in, and the needed aircraft did not exist. There were 3 raw designs sent back to the drawing boards, and there was a ticking clock counting down to a great war. The dead end looked almost mocking. Everything was ready, except the one thing that mattered. This goes to the very nature of such dead ends. They rarely resolve according to plan. Logic suggested waiting until one of the 3 brought its machine to maturity. But logic took no account of the fact that time was about to run out, and that the way out would be found nowhere near where it was being sought. While the Commission corrected other men's drawings, the resolution was already ripening, sudden, audacious, and provided for by no specification at all. And then the thunder broke. In September 1938, Europe came to the very edge of the abyss. The so-called Munich crisis erupted. A razor-sharp political clash over Czechoslovakia that almost tipped the continent into a great war right there and then. The smell of gunpowder turned real, and in that moment the British military realized, with cold horror, a simple thing. They had no night fighter, and they might need one literally tomorrow. This goes to the most terrible kind of time trouble, when time is not merely pressing but running out before your eyes. 3 designs lay in revision. Bringing any of them to maturity meant months that no longer existed. The war could begin before the first prototype tore itself off the runway. The situation looked hopeless. The customer wanted the machine yesterday, and the industry, at best, promised it the day after tomorrow. And into this dead end stepped a man whose name is worth remembering, the Bristol engineer, Leslie Fries. He did not propose yet another design from scratch, Yet another machine to be drawn and refined for a year. He looked at the problem from a completely different angle and asked himself an audacious question. Why build a new aircraft if the airframe needed is already standing on the factory slips? This goes to the key insight of the whole story. At that very moment, the Bristol Lines were assembling the twin-engine naval bomber Beaufort, a sturdy, proven, series-built machine. Wings, fuselage, tail unit, a refined production technology, all of it already existed in metal. Fries proposed not to reinvent, but to take the ready, Beaufort, and recut it in short order into a heavy cannon fighter, take the skeleton ready-made, and change the filling to suit the new task. The idea was at once simple and almost heretical. In aviation, it is not the custom to mold combat fighters out of bombers. These are machines of different breed, different character, different purpose. But it was precisely this audacity that proved to be the salvation. A ready airframe meant there was no need to walk the whole agonizing road from a blank sheet. Calculations, wind tunnel runs, the tuning of production. Half the work had already been done by other hands and by time. What remained was to convert, not to create. This goes to that rare case when the top brass did not drown a sound idea in approvals. The firm's leadership grasped the gain in time at once and gave Fries the green light. Having received the go-ahead, the engineer threw himself into the work with genuine enthusiasm. This was no sluggish labor out of duty, but a race against the oncoming war, and the man who had thought up the way out hurled himself into making it real. The calculation proved flawlessly sober. While the rivals from Hawker and Westland went on racking their brains over their from-scratch designs, Bristol gained an enormous head start. The machine could be put into the air not in years, but in months. In a climate where every week might be the last week of peace, that gain was worth more than any estimated speeds and elegant aerodynamic lines. So from political crisis, panic, and a shortage of time was born an idea that overturned the whole program. Not a brilliant drawing from a blank sheet, not a breakthrough theory, but the cold engineering pragmatism of one man who looked, at the right moment, not at the drawing board, but at the next assembly shop. The future Beaufighter began not as a designer's dream, but as a sober answer to the question, what can we actually manage to build before the guns begin to roar? By the start of 1939, the design was ready. And now the most interesting part, what exactly survived from the peaceful Beaufort, and what went under the knife? The answer is harsh. Little came through. From the bomber, only the wing outer panels, the rear fuselage, and the tail unit were kept unchanged. Everything else Fries and his men recut for a new and far angrier trade. This goes first of all to the crew, which was cut down without mercy. The Beaufort bomber carried 4 men, pilot, navigator, radio operator, gunner. In the new machine 2 remained, pilot and navigator. The logic was purely combat-driven. The night interceptor was conceived as a hunter, not as prey. It was assumed it would not have to fend off enemy fighters, since it would work in the dark, against bombers, remaining unseen itself. And if so, why drag along extra men and extra weight? From this conclusion flowed the next decision, just as cold and calculating. All defensive armament was stripped from the machine entirely. Away with the gun turret, away with the beam gun positions that had jutted from the bomber's sides. Everything meant to protect the rear hemisphere went for scrap. The interceptor did not intend to defend itself. It intended to strike first, and out of the darkness. This goes to the main transformation, the one the whole effort was for. The freed-up nose of the fuselage was given over to the new machine's teeth. Into it was mounted a battery of 4 automatic British Hispano cannon of 20mm caliber, exactly what the original specification demanded. The former bomb bay and the nose of the peaceful torpedo carrier turned into concentrated firepower. Where there had once been gear for reconnaissance and bombing, 4 barrels now stood, ready with a single burst to tear apart other men's machines in the night sky. But cannon mean weight, and weight demands thrust. The Beaufort's native engines, the Bristol Taurus units, would no longer do for the new role. They lacked the muscle. They were replaced with the more powerful Bristol Hercules, and that swap pulled a chain of other alterations behind it. Larger diameter propellers were fitted to the new engines, and since the propellers grew bigger, the nacelles had to be reworked and the main undercarriage legs lengthened so the blades would not catch the ground on takeoff and landing. One unit dragged another behind it, as is always the way in aviation. This goes to the very essence of Fries's work. He did not build, he rebuilt. A proven structure was taken, stripped of everything surplus to the new task, and given everything it required. Out went the 4 seats, out went the defensive barrels and the turret. In went powerful engines and heavy cannon. Outside went reworked nacelles and lengthened undercarriage legs. The bomber was literally turned inside out, its character retuned from the defensive to the predatory. The result was a hybrid machine in which a trained eye could still make out the family features of the Beaufort, but whose purpose had become diametrically opposite. A carrier of bombs and torpedoes was turning into a nighttime slayer of bombers. The wings, the tail, and part of the fuselage remained from the former peaceful trade, while the heart, the teeth, and the very essence of the machine were forged anew. It was precisely this conversion, carried out under the pressure of time, that laid the foundation of the future Beaufighter, an aircraft no one had yet seen in flight, but whose outlines had already taken on flesh and metal. The detailed working out of the design and the building of the prototype took several more months, and then came the day the whole effort had been for. On the 17th of July, 1939, the machine under the index Type 152 was taken into the air for the first time by the test pilot, Cyril Ewens. The future Beaufighter tore itself off the runway and climbed into the sky. The race against time, it seemed, had been won. The machine flew. This goes to the moment when delight gives way to a cold reckoning of figures, and the figures let everyone down. The prototype Ewens flew was, in essence, a lightened show specimen. It carried no armor, no armament, no oxygen bottles, no radio. That is, none of the heavy ironmongery without which a machine has no business in a real fight. By all logic, such a lightened aircraft was bound to fly faster than the estimate. Instead, it flew slower. Here is where the first bitter truth lay hidden. By design, the Type 152 was supposed to squeeze out 575 kilometers an hour. The bare, unburdened prototype reached only 540. 35 kilometers an hour lost out of nowhere, and that on a machine stripped of everything surplus. And ahead lay the unavoidable gain in weight: armor, cannon, ammunition, radio, oxygen. Every one of those units meant new kilograms and new lost units of speed. And the reckoning came quickly. The second prototype, flying now with full combat load, with all the things the lightened specimen had not even carried, barely managed to reach 520 kilometers an hour. The gap from the design figures became a gaping one. The machine had been conceived as a swift night hunter, and what came out was a somewhat heavy, speed-deficient craft that lost to its own technical requirement in the single most important parameter. This goes to a situation that, in peacetime, would have buried the project. An aircraft falling short of its estimated speed by nearly 60 kilometers an hour is, by any normal measure, a candidate for revision, if not cancellation. Any fastidious commission had every right to send the Type 152 back to the designers, just as it had recently sent back the 3 earlier designs. The logic of peacetime demanded exactly that. But what happened next looks almost like a paradox. The Air Ministry not only paid the firm for the building of the prototypes, it at once concluded a contract for the supply of 300 machines to the Royal Air Force. 300 production fighters straight away, without long refinement, effectively on the basis of a raw, speed-deficient specimen. An order for a machine that on paper counted as a failure. This goes to the main question that hangs in the air. Why do the military grab at an aircraft that has failed its own technical requirement? Why pay big money for a fighter slower than the drawings promised? At first glance, it looks like a collapse of common sense or somebody's blunder. In reality, behind that decision stood a cold, hard, and utterly merciless calculation. But of that, a little later. For now, let us fix the strange picture. There is a machine that flies, but flies slower than it should. There are prototypes that do not dazzle with their characteristics. And there is a contract for 300 production fighters, signed as though there had been no shortfall in speed at all. This gap between raw hardware and a generous order is the very knot in which the whole truth is hidden about why the Beaufighter went into production in the first place. So why did the ministry order 300 of a machine that had fallen short of its own drawings? The answer turned out to be insultingly simple and had nothing to do with any outstanding qualities of the Type 152. The point was not that this machine was so good. The point was that there was nothing else to choose from. This goes to the fate of those very rivals whose designs the Commission had earlier sent back for revision. They had not gone anywhere. They were still struggling. The alternative design from Westland, the future Whirlwind, had bogged down in serious technical problems. The machine from Hawker, out of which the famous Typhoon would later grow, was also drowning in difficulties and the whims of its construction. Both projects were promising on paper, but both promised a finished result, at best, not soon. And here is where the whole cruel arithmetic of the moment lies. On one scale pan, two elegant designs that might, someday, become excellent fighters and might not. On the other, a slow, raw, but genuinely flying Type 152 that could be put into production as early as tomorrow. The smell of gunpowder hung distinctly in the air again, and Britain simply had no time to wait for the ideal. Better a mediocre aircraft in service today than a superb one that exists only on the drawing board. This goes to the cold military logic that always defeats the logic of engineering perfectionism. A speed of 520 kilometers an hour is not brilliant, but it is a machine in hand, not a promise on paper. A ready airframe, a refined production line, real prototypes in the air. All the shortcomings of the Type 152 were outweighed by one single but decisive virtue. It existed and flew here and now, while the others were still only promising to take off. There was nothing to choose from, and the machine was put into production just as it was. And here history offers up a detail that makes it impossible to hold back a smirk. This clumsy, heavy, angular machine, heir to a slow bomber, short of speed, put into production effectively out of desperation, was given the name Beaufighter. And translated, that means nothing less than beautiful fighter. This goes to that rare case in technology when a name sounds like an open mockery of the appearance. There was not a grain of the beautiful in the look of the machine. Bulky outlines, a heavy angular nose, an obvious bomber origin bulging in every line of the fuselage. All of it sat least of all with the word beautiful. As though someone, with fine English irony, had dubbed the most graceless recruit in the ranks a handsome man. The name Beaufighter was born as the joining of two words, Beaufort, from which the machine inherited its airframe, and fighter, the new trade of yesterday's bomber. The result was at once logical and mocking. Sewn into that name is the whole dual nature of the aircraft, a bomber past and a fighter present, a graceless look and a fearsome purpose, the irony of the name and the seriousness of the task. But in that mockery lurked a prophetic note that no one then could yet make out. People smirked at the bulky, beautiful fighter, looking at its lines and its modest speed, and very little time would pass before that name would have to be pronounced in an entirely different way, without a shadow of irony. German crews in the night sky over England would be in no mood to laugh at the angular silhouette of a machine called a beauty as if in jest. And then the war broke out, and all the earlier calculations were obsolete in an instant. When, on the 1st of September 1939, the Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border, the attitude toward the raw fighter changed at once. Those 300 ordered machines suddenly looked like a drop in the ocean. The opening of a great war instantly spurred the military's appetites, and the order for Beaufighters grew to 1,200. This goes to the very nature of war, which devours hardware faster than the factories can turn it out. 1,200 machines, and even that proved too few. A contract for a further 1,000 fighters was signed next. The figures climbed swiftly, turning yesterday's improvisation by a single engineer into one of the load-bearing spines of British combat aviation. The machine that had been smirked at only recently was now wanted by the 1,000. But every mass scale has its reverse side. Production capacity is not made of rubber. The Bristol assembly plant at Filton, the Beaufighters' home, physically could not master such volumes of supply. Military demand far outran the capacity of a single enterprise. The production base had to be expanded in a hurry, and subcontractors called in to help. This goes to how, under the pressure of war, the whole industrial chain was rebuilt. The firm Ferry was brought into the building of Beaufighters, shouldering part of the enormous order. At the same time, the construction of a large aircraft factory at Weston was being completed, and as early as February 1941, it began turning out finished products. Production spread across several sites, building up the combined output of machines. The first production Beaufighters, in the Mark 1F variant, where the letter F stood for fighter, entered service in July 1940. The machine went to the operational squadrons, but here a new and entirely unexpected enemy reared up, and not in the air, but on the ground, in the very basis of the design. This goes to the sore spot of the whole program, the Bristol Hercules engines. There was a desperate shortage of these motors, and not only for the Beaufighter. The same Hercules units were needed in large numbers by other combat aircraft too, and demand for them far exceeded supply. A deficit arose that threatened to choke the entire output. And then a forced decision was born, one that turned into yet another dead end. If there are not enough Hercules, let us fit other engines. Thus appeared the Beaufighter in the Mark 2F variant with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines of the 20 series, liquid-cooled. On paper, a way out. In practice, a step backward by almost every measure. The Merlins, in this role, proved both less powerful and less reliable than the heavy machine required. The result was as predictable as it was dispiriting. This goes to the hard truth of figures, which cannot be fooled. With the new engines, almost all the flight characteristics of the Beaufighter worsened. The maximum speed of an already unhurried machine sagged to 485 kilometers an hour. An aircraft that had hardly dazzled with briskness in the first place became even more sluggish and capricious. The Mark 2F turned out frankly unsuccessful. For a time, both variants were produced in parallel, the main one with Hercules and the forced one with Merlins. But the plainly weak modification was not tolerated for long. In view of its obvious failure, the Mark 2F was taken out of production. And here history leaves a characteristic human touch. Those who flew these knowingly weak machines were, for the most part, not the English themselves, but volunteers, Poles, Czechs, and other émigrés who had fled to Britain from the German occupation. The best, well-tuned Beaufighters went to their own, while the problem modification was more often handed to those who had come to a foreign country to fight for a common cause. And now, about the thing for the sake of which one can forget, the modest speed. Yes, the Beaufighter did not dazzle with briskness, but it had something else, something that turned its shortcomings into trifles. It had firepower that no fighter of its time possessed. And it was right here that the machine with the ironic name took a cruel revenge for all the smirks. This goes to a process that ran right through the course of production. The Beaufighter's armament was built up on the fly. 4 20mm cannon in the nose, laid down by the specification itself, was already serious. But the designers decided that serious was not enough. Beginning with the 51st production specimen, machine guns were added as well, turning the heavy interceptor into a genuine flying battery. 6 Browning machine guns were placed in the wing outer panels, clear of the propeller discs, so the bursts would not strike its own blades. They were distributed unevenly, with an eye to practicality. 4 barrels in the right wing and 2 in the left. There were fewer guns in the left wing because, besides them, room had been found there for the landing light. The machine bristled with barrels without losing the small things that real service required. This goes to the final arithmetic that turned any opponent cold inside. Added all together, 4 automatic cannon in the nose plus 6 wing machine guns. The total, 10 barrels firing forward from a single machine. 10 gun positions converged on one aiming point somewhere ahead along the heading. Wherever the Beaufighter's nose was pointed, a true squall of metal came crashing down. But the number of barrels is only half the matter. What counts is the mass of the 1-second burst, that is, how much lead and steel the machine throws into the target in a single second of fire. For the Beaufighter, this figure reached 6.2 kilograms per second. 6 odd kilograms of metal flying into the enemy every second is not damage, it is destruction. 1 accurate pass, and the enemy machine literally fell apart in the air, exactly as the original specification had demanded. This goes to the thing that places the Beaufighter among the absolute record holders of its era. In mass of the 1-second burst, it simply had no equal among fighters. No production fighter of that period could throw so much metal into a target in a second. The angular heir to a bomber, smirked at only recently, turned out to be the most heavily armed fighter in the sky. And this superiority held not for a month and not for a year. No rival equal to the Beaufighter in firepower appeared until almost the very end of the war. Only in its finale did the American heavy night fighter, the P-61 Black Widow from Northrop, come onto the scene. A grim, purpose-built machine whose very name translates as a venomous spider. But until its appearance, the Beaufighter had no equal in this class at all. So the main thesis of the whole story, declared from the very start, was confirmed. A machine that had lost to its own drawings in speed, a machine with a mocking name and a bomber pedigree, turned out to be the most powerful heavy fighter of almost the entire Second World War. Not the fastest, not the most elegant, the most powerful. And in the night sky, where the outcome of a fight is decided by one sudden burst at point-blank range, it was precisely this quality that was worth more than all the rest put together. But firepower is only half of what made the Beaufighter the king of the night. 10 barrels are useless if you cannot see where to shoot, and in the black night sky nothing can be seen. And it is here that the second storyline enters the history, perhaps even more important than the cannon, a secret technology that changed the rules of the night hunt forever. This goes to a small technical detail that at first seemed a matter of routine. On the first 400 Beaufighters, the cannon had magazine feed. Each gun was allotted 4 drum magazines, 60 rounds in each. As the ammunition was used up, the navigator was obliged to change the emptied drums for full ones by hand. Heavy, awkward work in a shuddering cockpit. Then the cannon were converted to belt feed, and the navigator suddenly found himself free of the role of ammunition carrier, and just in time. Because for the navigators, freed from fussing with magazines, far more skilled and far more secret work was found. In the autumn of 1940, they began to be retrained as operators of radio location stations. Yesterday's loader was turning into the operator of a device that could see in the dark what the human eye could not. This goes to a technology that stood, at that time, at the very cutting edge of military science. The first radiolocation station compact enough to fit on a relatively small fighter was created in Britain only in 1939. It was tested on the Bristol Blenheim bomber. The radar under the Index AI Mark IV was a rather bulky construction that weighed 270 kilograms and, for operation in flight, required a separate, specially trained crew member. And here everything came together as if to order. 270 kilograms of complex apparatus had to be placed somewhere, and at the same time, an extra man had to be carried aboard to work it. A light single-seat fighter simply would not do for this, neither the room nor the hands. But the Beaufighter, roomy, twin-engine, the heavy heir to a bomber, with a second crew member aboard, suited this role better than any other machine in the Royal Air Force. This goes to that very case where yesterday's shortcoming turns into the chief trump card. People had smirked at the Beaufighter's bulk, considering its heavy bomber airframe a burden. But it was precisely this surplus of volume and lifting capacity that made it easy to wedge the heavy radar into the machine and seat an operator beside the pilot. What had hindered it in the role of a fast fighter proved priceless in the role of a night hunter with radar aboard, and the airmen themselves felt this perfectly well. To the new device, which let them find the enemy in total darkness, in cloud, at zero visibility, they gave an apt, almost superstitious nickname, the Magic Mirror. In those words there was both a measure of admiration for technology bordering on sorcery and the sense of secrecy that surrounded the radar, a mirror in which was reflected that which the eye could not see. So the Beaufighter acquired a second weapon, no less fearsome than the 10 barrels. Now the machine did not merely carry monstrous firepower, it gained eyes able to see in pitch darkness. The heavy cannon and the magic mirror joined in a single aircraft, and that combination turned the angular heir to a bomber into an ideal night predator. It only remained to test the pairing in a real fight. First, the magic mirror was tested in earnest. On the 8th of September 1940, the first heavy fighters with radar aboard entered the 600th Air Defense Squadron for accelerated service trials. The trials went successfully, and from November, the radar-equipped Beaufighters went into large-scale production. And soon the pairing of cannon and radar gave its first truly resounding result, the one that entered the history of the night war. This goes to the night of the 19th to the 20th of November 1940. Visibility was practically zero, a dense black shroud in which the human eye made out nothing. It was on just such a night that the first successful interception by a Beaufighter with onboard radar of an aerial enemy took place. The machine was on its combat heading, and at the radar screen sat the radio operator Sergeant Phillipson, while the controls were held by the pilot, Lieutenant Cunningham. And then the mirror spoke. During the combat patrol, Phillipson reported to the pilot, an aerial target detected 5 kilometers to the north. The crew's eyes saw absolutely nothing. Solid murk stood all around, but the radar held the blip steadily. Cunningham at once changed course, trusting not his sight but the glowing spot on the screen, and led the machine toward the unseen enemy. This goes to the most nerve-wracking stage of any night interception, the blind approach. The Beaufighter passed through a solid bank of cloud, guided only by the operator's reports and the blip on the radar. The distance slowly shrank. The pilot flew the heavy machine strictly on direction, meter by meter, creeping up on a target he still could not see with his own eyes. The hunter stalked its prey in total darkness, led only by the magic mirror. And at last, the blackness ahead took on form. The enemy aircraft became distinguishable to the naked eye, and Cunningham recognized in it a twin-engine German bomber, the Junkers 88, one of those very night visitors against whom the whole hard specification had once been written. The prey was identified, and now everything turned on composure and precision. This goes to the classic tactic of the night hunter, honed to perfection. Remaining unnoticed by the enemy, Cunningham carefully slipped into the bomber's tail. The German crew, by all appearances, never grasped that someone was stalking them in the dark. The Englishman coolly closed the distance to about 200 meters, almost point blank by the measures of air combat, and loosed a burst from all barrels at once, and here that very firepower came into play. 6 odd kilograms of metal per second came down on the Junkers in one crushing blow. The bomber blazed up and went down, wrapped in flame, sinking back into the same darkness out of which the magic mirror had just snatched it. In the morning, the wreckage of the German machine was found in the vicinity of the town of Wittering, material proof that the night war had just changed forever. This goes to the man whose name became a legend after that night. Lieutenant John Cunningham went on with his tally, and by May 1941, together with a new radio operator, Sergeant Rawnsley, he had won 8 more victories. By the end of the war, this ace's account listed 19 enemy machines destroyed in night fights, and most of them he had brought down precisely on the Beaufighter. And he was also given a nickname that perfectly conveyed the essence of what was happening, though the true reason was not explained to the public. Cunningham came to be called Cat's Eyes, as if he really could see in the dark like a cat. In reality, his cat's eyes were that very magic mirror, the secret radar of which it was not then the custom to speak aloud. So was born a fine legend that screened a cold and utterly merciless new technology. What happened over Wittering was not a one-off stroke of luck, but the first shot of a whole new era. The magic mirror worked a true revolution in the tactics of night-air combat. The helplessness of the Zeppelin days, when an interceptor clawed blindly into the sky after a vanished enemy, was at last left in the past. Now the defense had eyes that saw in the dark and teeth able to break apart a bomber with a single burst. This goes to a simple and merciless regularity that switched on at once. The more radar Beaufighters entered the operational units, the heavier the reckoning became for the Germans. The connection was direct and inexorable. As the number of radar night fighters rose, so rose the losses among the German night bombers. What had until recently been a safe nocturnal stroll over English cities was turning into a deadly, risky enterprise. To gauge the scale of the turning point, it is worth looking at the whole picture of Britain's air defense as one. It had 2 faces, 2 utterly different battles, the daytime one and the nocturnal one. And in each of them worked their own machines, their own heroes, and their own tactics. The day belonged to one set of fighters, the night to another entirely. This goes to the most famous chapter, the Battle of Britain, fought out in the light of day. It was then, in the daytime sky, that the swift and maneuverable Spitfires and Hurricanes shielded the country with their own bodies. It was they who, in open daytime clashes, broke the spine of the German air armadas. It was their silhouettes that entered legend as the saviors of Britain. The daytime raids shattered against their wings. But the war had a second, dark half of the day as well, recalled far more rarely. When the sun went down and the Spitfires and Hurricanes could no longer make out the enemy in the black sky, other machines came into play. The heavy Beaufighters took up the night shift with their magic mirror and their 10 barrels, and it was they who took upon themselves the war that cannot be waged in the light. This goes to the main outcome, which can be put with the utmost hardness and clarity. If, in the course of the Battle of Britain, the Spitfires and Hurricanes defended the country from daytime raids, then in the following months the Beaufighters broke the Germans of the habit of bombing by night with impunity. Before, the dark had been an ally of the German crews, reliably hiding them from the defense. Now the dark ceased to be a shelter. Within it lurked a night hunter with radar, and the psychological effect was no less than the combat one. German crews, who had once set off on a night sortie almost as on routine work, now knew. Somewhere in that blackness, an unseen machine was already searching for them, one impossible to spot and almost impossible to escape. Every night sortie over England turned into a game with a fatal outcome. where the stake was the crew itself. Impunity had come to an end. So the angular heir to a bomber, the machine put into production out of desperation and named a beauty as if in mockery, became the shield of Britain in her darkest hours. The Spitfire saved the country while the sun shone. The Beaufighter guarded it when night fell. And in this nocturnal half of the war, the grim, beautiful fighter turned out to be exactly what it had been conceived to be, the master of the dark sky. But this nocturnal power had its price, and it was people who paid it. Not every pilot could handle a heavy night hunter in pitch darkness. That demanded a special, almost jeweler's level of training. The Beaufighter squadrons were filled not with yesterday's graduates, but with pilots of the highest class, who had passed a hard selection. This goes to those very selection criteria from which it becomes clear what level is being spoken of. To even lay claim to a place in the cockpit of a night fighter, a candidate had to have a total flying time of no less than 600 hours. Of these, at least 30 hours blind, on instruments, with no visibility at all beyond the canopy. And on top of that, no fewer than 40 night landings carried out. Only after passing through this sieve did a pilot earn the right to sit at the controls of a Beaufighter. And such a bar was not set out of overcaution. The machine itself demanded it. The Beaufighter was marked by strictness in handling and forgave mistakes far less readily than a pilot would have wished. It had insufficient lateral and directional stability. In other words, the heavy aircraft was apt to yaw and banked reluctantly, requiring of the airman constant attention and a firm hand. In daytime flight, this was unpleasant. At night, blind, on instruments, deadly dangerous. This goes to the bitter statistics that accompanied the service of the night interceptors. Despite the harshest selection and hundreds of hours of flying, accidents and crashes remained anything but rare. And the hardest thing in those statistics is where the main losses came from. Most of the casualties among the crews of the night fighters came not from air combat at all. They were taken not by enemy cannon, but by the night itself, by the machine that was difficult to handle, and by the treacherously hard landing in the dark. And here lies a paradox that overturns the usual notions of war in the air. The combat losses of the specialized night interceptors were, in essence, negligible. The reason is simple and logical. To shoot down an attacking night fighter in the dark is a near impossible task. It is itself unseen, it itself chooses the moment of the strike, it itself slips out of the blackness into the tail of an unsuspecting victim. The enemy had practically nothing to hit such a hunter with, and almost nothing to grasp at. This goes to a hard conclusion that is difficult to digest at first. It turned out that the chief enemy of a night Beaufighter's crew was not the German, but their own machine, the dark sky, and the airfield drowning in night. The pilots of this elite died not so much in clashes with the enemy as on the approach to landing, in cloud, in disorientation, in the struggle with the willful character of the heavy aircraft. The enemy could hardly reach them, but the night and the hardware could. Naturally, the designers did not sit on their hands and set about curing the machine's temper. Beginning with the Mark VI modification, the Beaufighter's tailplane began to be set at a dihedral angle of 12 degrees. This tail, raised up into a tent, noticeably improved stability and made the machine's behavior in the air more predictable. The angular night predator was gradually trained to discipline, step by step, softening that very strict character which had cost more than one picked crew their lives. Until now, the Beaufighter had been a shield. It guarded its home sky, meeting enemy bombers over English cities. But a quality came to light in the machine that allowed the shield to be turned into a sword. The long range, inherited from the Beaufort bomber, opened up to the Beaufighter the road far beyond the British coast. The hunter, used to waiting for the enemy at home, set off himself onto foreign territory. This goes to a new and rather audacious role, the escort of night bombers. When the British bomber armadas went off on raids over the continent, German night fighters lay in wait for them in the dark, and the losses were at times heavy. And now, together with the bombers, Beaufighters began going off into the enemy sky. Their task was predatory in essence, not so much to cover their own as to track down and destroy German night interceptors on the Germans' own ground. But how do you find an enemy night fighter in the black sky over occupied Europe? Here, another secret device came into use, a match for the magic mirror. The Beaufighters were fitted with special apparatus called Serrate. It was, in essence, an anti-radar, a sniffer device. It did not emit itself, but silently caught the radiation of German onboard locators and guided the English crew straight to the source of the signal. This goes to a reversal of roles in the night sky that is eerie in its logic. A German night fighter switched on its radar to find a British bomber, and by that very act gave itself away. Its own locator, its chief instrument of the hunt, turned into a radio beacon that led the Beaufighter to it. The hunter himself became the prey, not suspecting that the beam of his radar had already brought a predator out of the darkness to him. Serrate turned the night war on its head. The resolution of this confrontation was not long in coming. In the summer of 1943, the first air battles took place between Beaufighters and German Messerschmitts, the Bf 110, fitted with onboard Liechtenstein radars. Two schools of the night hunt collided, two pairings of radar and cannon. And the superiority of the British machine showed itself very quickly and very plainly. This goes to one episode whose figures speak for themselves. On the night of the 7th to the 8th of September, the crews of the 141st Squadron intercepted German night fighters over Holland. The outcome of that night was crushing. 13 Messerschmitts brought down against only 3 Beaufighters lost, 13 against 3, a ratio that needs no comment and leaves no doubt as to whose pairing of radar and barrels proved the more lethal. This score is worth remembering because in it lies the whole essence of the transformation. The machine that had been put into production out of desperation and named a beauty, as if in mockery, now no longer hid in defense, but came itself into the foreign sky and smashed the enemy's specialized night hunters there. 13 Messerschmitts in a single night is no longer the defense of Britain. It is the carrying of the war onto the enemy's territory. So the Beaufighter completed its transformation from the defending into the attacking. First, it broke the Germans of the habit of bombing English cities with impunity. Then it went so far as to break them of the habit of flying with impunity over their own occupied Europe. The grim, beautiful fighter turned from a guardian of its home sky into a night aggressor, now feared on the far side of the Channel. By the autumn of 1941, the line of the night fighter had reached its peak. In October, the production of the next modification began, the Beaufighter Mark V YF. The intermediate designations, Mark III, Mark IV, and Mark V, were not built in series, so it was precisely the 6 that became the logical continuation and development of the combat night version. Into it was gathered all the best that had been worked out by that time. This goes to the 2 chief changes that marked out the new machine. First, on it at last took hold that very tailplane set at a dihedral angle, which had softened the aircraft's willful character. Second, the 6 was fitted with improved Hercules Mark VI engines. Their power had been increased, and following it, the machine's maximum speed grew as well. The Beaufighter became a touch brisker, while remaining the same heavily armed night hunter. The magic mirror was being perfected too. In December, the 6s began to be fitted with a new AI Mark VIII radar with a parabolic antenna, more advanced than the earlier sets. The antenna of the new type required a reworking. For its sake, the very shape of the nose fairing of the fuselage was changed. The machine's characteristic nose took on new outlines, beneath which a far keener electronic eye was concealed. This goes to an important boundary that is worth marking out plainly. It was precisely on the Mark V IF modification that the path of the Beaufighter's development as a night fighter, in essence, came to an end. Beyond this, that branch no longer grew. The design had reached its ceiling in the role of night interceptor. The machine had said, in that part, everything it could, and there was by now almost nothing to add to what had been said. And meanwhile, a successor had come onto the scene, and it was of an entirely different breed. From 1943, the Beaufighters in the role of night fighters began gradually to be replaced by the Mosquito, the famous wooden machines of the de Havilland firm. The Mosquitoes were noticeably more aerodynamic and far faster. Where the angular Beaufighter won by firepower and lifting capacity, the elegant Mosquito added to a similar armament that swiftness which the heavy veteran had always lacked. This goes to the simple and inexorable logic of the changing of generations in wartime aviation. Hardware grew obsolete swiftly, and yesterday's master of the night sky yielded its place to a more advanced air. There was no drama and no disgrace in this. An aircraft had simply come along that did the same work faster and more cleanly. The Beaufighter had already fulfilled its historical task in the night defense, and fulfilled it in abundance. And so came the quiet finale of the night career. The last Beaufighters of the Mark V IF modification were withdrawn from the combat air defense squadrons and handed over to training units in August 1944. The fearsome night hunter, once a terror to German crews, was now teaching young pilots far from the front line. With this, the night chapter in the machine's biography was closing, quietly, without loud battles, as befits a departing veteran. But it was still far too early to write the Beaufighter off. Having ended one career, the machine was already unfolding another, far longer, and not at all like the nocturnal one. While the Mosquito was taking the dark sky over Britain for itself, the angular veteran was departing into a new element, where other targets, other seas, and an entirely different glory awaited it. If in the role of a night fighter, the Beaufighter eventually yielded its place to the Mosquito, then at sea its career was only beginning, and proved to be far longer. Here, over the cold waves, the angular machine found its second calling, in which it served considerably longer than in the sky over English cities. Though the naval Beaufighters were by now somewhat different aircraft, sharpened for a new element. This goes to the very beginning of the naval line, to the year 1940. The headquarters of Britain's coastal defense demanded the creation of a special version of the Beaufighter for patrolling the coastal zone and providing air cover for sea convoys. The transports moving along the coasts needed protection, and for this work, an aircraft of long endurance was required. The Beaufighter, with its solid range, suited it ideally. So appeared the Mark I-C modification, where the letter C pointed to its belonging to Coastal Command. From the fighter version, it differed above all in fuel. Additional petrol tanks were placed in the wing outer panels, noticeably increasing the range of flight. As for wing machine guns, this machine had none. For patrol work over the sea, 10 barrels proved superfluous. From November 1940, the Mark I-C went into production in large numbers. This goes to the natural development of the naval branch as new engines appeared. The very same aircraft, but now with the more advanced Hercules Mark VI engines, began to be produced from November 1941 under the index Mark V-YC. The naval version grew and gained strength in parallel with the fighter one, step by step, preparing for a far more fearsome role than mere patrolling. And that role was not long in coming. In April 1942, one of the Sixes was tested in an entirely new capacity, as a torpedo carrier. Beneath the machine's fuselage, an aerial torpedo of 18-inch caliber was slung, and it was checked whether yesterday's night hunter was able to carry and employ this heavy and capricious weapon. The conversion proved unusually successful. This goes to the birth of one of the most fearsome naval machines of that war. The trials went successfully, the aircraft was taken into service and assigned the index Mark 5th Force TP, that is, torpedo fighter. Before this, as shore-based torpedo carriers the English had employed converted Beaufort and Hampton bombers. The new Beaufighter torpedo carrier surpassed these old machines in practically every respect, yielding only in one, in defensive armament, of which the Predator, as we recall, had almost none. And here onto the scene comes the resounding name under which the naval Beaufighter entered history. The Beaufighter torpedo carrier received the unofficial nickname Torbeau. It was born from the joining of two words, the English torpedo and Beaufighter. Torpedo plus Beaufighter. Out came the snappy, easily remembered Torbeau, which stuck fast to the machine and was kept for all the subsequent naval modifications. So for one and the same airframe, a third life began. First, there had been the bulky night fighter, the terror of German bombers. Then, the night aggressor, knocking out Messerschmitts over Europe. And now, over the sea waves, the Torbeau was being born. A torpedo carrier destined to become a nightmare for enemy convoys and submarines. The angular air of the Beaufort was changing trade once again, and once again with a clear margin of superiority over everything that had come before it. The first Torbeau was only a rough draft. To turn a converted fighter into a true killer of ships, the machine had to be recut anew, this time to the laws of naval war. And the very first of those laws concerned the altitude at which a torpedo carrier works. This goes to the fundamental contradiction between a fighter and a torpedo carrier. The Hercules Mark 6 engines that stood on the fighter versions were high-altitude units. They gave their maximum power high in the sky, where a night interceptor is meant to fight. But a torpedo carrier lives in an entirely different world. It attacks right down by the water, at the height of the wave crests, coming onto the target almost flush with the surface. Up here, the high-altitude engines only got in the way. The solution was logical: give the machine a different heart. Before long, the Torbeau was fitted with new Hercules Mark 10 engines, which developed their maximum power at an altitude of 500 feet, that is only about 150 meters above the water. It was precisely there, right by the waves, where a torpedo carrier conducts its lethal attack, that the machine now had all its power at its disposal. The aircraft was finally moved out of the lofty element down to the very surface of the sea. This goes to the swift buildup of the machine's striking arsenal. The matter did not end with a single torpedo. Under the Torbeau's wings appeared hardpoints for two 500-pound bombs, or for launch rails of 8 3-inch rockets, 4 under each panel. And in the navigator's cabin, a defensive machine gun turret with a pneumatic drive was at last installed, covering the rear hemisphere. The Predator, which had begun life with no rear defense at all, acquired a sting in its tail as well. So was born the most famous naval modification, the Beaufighter under the index TF Mark 10. It became the most numerous version of the machine in all its history. It was precisely the 10, armed with torpedo, bombs, and rockets, that formed the backbone of the British naval strike squadrons. This was the summit of the whole naval branch's development, a machine brought to the very limit of its striking capabilities. This goes to the paradox embedded in its very designation. Although the 10 was still officially counted a torpedo fighter, of the fighter there remained in it absolutely nothing. Neither the role nor the task nor the habits of the former night interceptor. The machine, once born as a pure fighter out of a bomber, had come full circle and turned back into a strike aircraft. This was a pure torpedo carrier, bearing the word fighter in its name only by old habit, and yet one thread tied the 10 to its fearsome forebears. Despite the increased weight, the torpedo beneath its belly, the bombs, the rockets, and the defensive turret, the Beaufighter remained the fastest torpedo carrier of the Second World War. The fighter breed it had been given at birth had gone nowhere. It had merely hidden beneath the load of naval weaponry. This goes to the key advantage that made the 10 so dangerous. A torpedo carrier is always vulnerable at the moment of the attack. It goes on to the target straight, low, and slow under the fire of shipboard anti-aircraft artillery. And here, extra units of speed became a matter of life. Being faster than any other torpedo carrier of the war, the Torpedo reached the attack line faster, dropped its torpedo faster, and got out from under the fire faster. The former fighter had kept exactly that quality which a torpedo carrier needed most of all: swiftness. By 1943, the Torpedo had turned from an experimental curiosity into the terror of the German sea lanes. These machines hunted with success after German ships and submarines in the North Sea, in the English Channel, and in the Bay of Biscay. The sea, once safe for enemy transports, suddenly became deadly dangerous. This goes to the appearance of a special combat instrument, the strike wing. The British created a special unit named the strike wing, which means exactly that, a striking wing. It consisted of 3 squadrons of Beaufighters, 2 torpedo and bomb squadrons, which delivered the main blow, and 1 fighter squadron, which cleared the sky over the target. This was an independent tactical unit, sharpened for the free hunting of any sea targets at all. The wing was not tied to a single convoy or a single route. It was given a free hand to seek out and destroy the enemy wherever he turned up. At the start of 1944, a second such strike wing was already formed. British naval aviation was acquiring ever longer and sharper claws. This goes to one of the most telling episodes of their work. On the 15th of May, 1944, off the coast of Holland, the Torpedoes came down upon a large German convoy. With torpedoes and rocket fire, they sent to the bottom 2 transports of 4 and 8,000 tons displacement and a minesweeper along with them. A further 6 steamers and 4 minesweepers took serious damage. And now the main thing: among the attackers, there was not a single loss. A whole convoy smashed, and not one machine brought down. This goes to an even broader theater, the Mediterranean Sea, where the Beaufighters truly came into their own. They operated from bases in Egypt and on Malta, and after the Allied landing on the Apennine Peninsula, already from the airfields of southern Italy. Here they became a real terror to the Italo-German convoys in the Aegean and Adriatic seas, cutting through the enemy's sea arteries. On the 28th of August, 1944, their victim became the large Italian motor ship Giulio Cesare. And a mere 10 days later, there happened something worth describing in particular. A flight of 8 Beaufighters attacked with rockets the giant superliner Rex of 51,000 tons displacement, a true sea colossus, mobilized for military transport. This goes to the figures that speak of the accuracy of the strike better than any epithets. At the enormous liner, 64 rockets were fired. 59 found their target. 59 out of 64. Almost everything that was launched found its mark. One can only imagine what remained of the ship after such a squall of fire. The Sea Giant was literally torn to pieces by a flight of 8 angular machines. And it is in these episodes that the Beaufighter's naval line reaches its culmination. The machine that had begun as a raw night fighter was now sinking 1,000-ton transports by whole convoys and single-handedly dealing with sea colossi of 50,000 tons. What had begun as defense in the sky over England had turned, in the waters of the Mediterranean, into a merciless and almost unpunished hunt. The beautiful fighter had found at last the element in which its firepower and swiftness opened up to their full force. Before leaving the subject of combat use, it is worth casting an eye over the whole map. The Beaufighter fought by no means only in the sky over Britain and in the waters of the Mediterranean. The sweep of its service was truly global, and to appraise the machine at its true worth, one must see that whole sweep in full. This goes to the makeup of the forces operating in the Mediterranean theater alone. Here fought at once 6 squadrons of Beaufighter Mark V 1F, 4 squadrons of the Mark V IC with rocket armament, and 2 squadrons of TF Mark X torpedo carriers. The rocket-armed Sixes earned their own snappy nickname, Rock Bow, from the English rocket Beaufighter. And alongside the British, 4 American squadrons of night fighters from the United States 12th Air Force also flew these machines. But the matter was far from confined to the Mediterranean. No less widely was the Beaufighter employed at the other end of the globe, in the Pacific Ocean and in Southeast Asia. Over the jungles, the islands, and the boundless ocean expanses, the angular machine proved as fitting as over the cold waves of the North Sea. The war scattered the Beaufighters across, quite literally, the whole world. This goes to the most interesting page of the machine's global biography, the Australian one. Australia did not merely receive ready-made British aircraft, but set up its own production of Beaufighters at the Fisherman's Bend plant. Moreover, an original local modification of the Torbeau was produced there under the index Mark 21, effectively the Australian version of the famous torpedo carrier. And this version had its own characteristic distinctions. In place of 6 rifle-caliber wing machine guns, the Australian machine was fitted with 4 American heavy-caliber Colt Browning guns. The higher the caliber, the heavier the blow. The local armorers recut the armament to suit what was available and effective in that theater, strengthening still further the machine's already serious firepower. This goes to the most recognizable external mark of the Australian Beaufighters. They were easy to tell apart by a characteristic rectangular bulge on the fuselage, right in front of the pilot's cockpit. Beneath that bulge was concealed a Sperry autopilot, a thing extremely valuable for the long patrol flights over the boundless ocean, where for hours on end there is nothing for the pilot's eye to catch on. In addition, the Australian machines were fitted with rocket and bomb hardpoints and a tail machine gun turret. The Australian branch proved a most prolific one. The first Mark 21 took to the air on the 26th of May, 1944. And by the very end of the war, the Australian Air Force had managed to receive 365 such machines. A whole fleet of Beaufighters built at the other end of the world under a different sky for a different war. So the true scale of this machine takes shape. Britain, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, its own production in Australia, American crews in the cockpits. The Beaufighter became a truly worldwide soldier. The angular air of the Beaufort, once put into production out of desperation, in the end fought in all the main theaters of the Second World War and under the flags of several powers at once. And so the war came to an end, and with it the long biography of the machine. The last Beaufighter rolled off the line in September 1945, when the guns had already fallen silent. Over all the years of production, 6,299 aircraft of every modification had been built. An impressive figure for a machine once put into series out of desperation, with little real faith in its future. This goes to the unenviable but typical lot of military hardware in peacetime. With the coming of peace, an enormous air armada turned out to be simply unneeded. In the post-war disarmament, most of the Beaufighters were sent to the scrap heap. Thousands of fearsome machines were simply cut up for metal. That which had only recently sunk convoys and guarded the night sky now lay in mountains of scrap on the breaking yards. This goes to the rare fortunate ones that were granted one more term of service abroad. Part of the machines went off to other countries. 24 Beaufighters were bought by Turkey, 16 by Portugal, and 10 by the Dominican Republic. And in the Dominican Air Force, these aircraft served unusually long, right up to 1965, outliving almost all the rest of the machines of their generation. But one page of the Beaufighter's post-war fate is wrapped in genuine mystery. 5 of these machines were secretly acquired by Israel, and that even before the independence of that state had been officially recognized. The deal went through in circumvention of an embargo, covertly, on a semi-legal footing. The fate of that 5 turned out hard. One aircraft crashed while still on the ferry flight from England, and the rest were lost in the course of the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948–49. This goes to the quiet fading of a once fearsome machine. Those Beaufighters that remained at home in England, for the most part, lived out their days far from any glory. They were gathered into training units and converted into towers of aerial targets. Now they dragged behind them the banners at which others learned to shoot. Yesterday's Predator had turned into a flying target tug, an uncomplaining drudge on the back lots of aviation. And here is the final, almost elegiac reckoning. Of the 6,000-odd machines built, of that whole armada that had thundered over 3 oceans and a good half of the war's theaters, just 2 Beaufighters of the TF Mark 10 modification remain alive to our day. Just 2 out of the thousands that came off the line. One of them is kept today in the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, the other in the National Museum of Canada. This goes to that very aftertaste for the sake of which such stories are worth telling at all. 2 surviving aircraft in quiet museum halls. That is all that remains of the beautiful fighter in the flesh. The machine, born in haste out of a bomber, mocked for its graceless look, short of speed, became in the end the most powerful heavy fighter of almost the entire war, the terror of the night sky, and the killer of convoys on 3 oceans. People had smirked at it, calling it a beauty as if in mockery. And it went through the whole war from the first day to the last, changed several trades, fought under the flags of half a dozen countries, and left behind its smashed convoys, downed bombers, and a legend of its own. And now, frozen beneath the museum vaults, the angular Beaufighter silently reminds us, sometimes the plainest recruit turns out to be the most dangerous warrior in the ranks. 2 aircraft beneath museum vaults, thousands to the scrap heap. So much for the gratitude owed for a war won in the dark and over the waves. The machine written off as a beauty, as if in mockery, turned out deadlier than all who laughed at it, and vanished almost without a trace the moment the guns fell silent. And here remains a question to which history never gave a straight answer. What truly made the Beaufighter the king of the night? The 10 barrels and the heavy burst, or the secret magic mirror of which it was then forbidden to speak aloud? Or perhaps it was decided not by the cannon and not by the radar, but by the men themselves, those picked, cat's-eyed crews who died more often on landing than in battle? And what do you think? What turned the angular air of a bomber into the most powerful heavy fighter of the war? The brilliant calculation of the engineer Freeze, the cold technology, or the composure of the men in the cockpit? Write your versions in the comments. Argue, bring your reasons. The sharpest thoughts are always born in collision. Hit like if you want more truth of this kind, with no gloss and no forgotten pages. Subscribe and switch on the bell to be the first to reach the archives of inconvenient facts about the machines that changed the course of the war, and of which almost none remain alive. And we are already opening the next file.